The rain poured mercilessly as a small figure trembled in the shadows, locked out and forgotten by those who should have cared the most. Little did she know that fate was about to intervene when a luxury car slowed to a halt, and a voice that would change everything spoke from within. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The rain fell in sheets, each drop a cold needle against 8-year-old Leela's skin. Her thin cotton pajamas, once pink with cartoon bears, now clung to her small frame like a second skin, darkened by the relentless downpour. Virginia storms were merciless in spring, and this one showed no signs of letting up. Leela's tiny fists pounded against the front door, her knuckles red and raw. "Please let me in," she whimpered, her voice barely audible above the thunder. "I'm sorry. I promise I'll be good." Behind the frosted glass door, Delilah moved like a shadow, her silhouette visible through the decorative patterns. The stepmother turned up the volume on the stereo system, drowning out the child's pleas with classical music that clashed with the storm's natural symphony. She swirled red wine in a crystal glass, taking a long, deliberate sip as she glanced toward the door with cool indifference. Another hour should teach her, Delilah murmured to herself, satisfaction curling her lips. The woman had calculated this punishment carefully, long enough to break the child's spirit, but not long enough to raise questions from neighbors. After all, maintaining appearances was everything in their suburban Virginia community. Outside, Lila slumped against the porch column, her small shoulders shaking with sobs that had grown quieter as exhaustion set in. The cold had numbed her fingers and toes, and a dangerous drowsiness began to creep through her body. Rain pooled around her bare feet, creating tiny rivers that carried away the leaf fragments she'd been absently collecting. The isolation pressed in on her, the neighboring houses dark, their occupants either asleep or away. No one to witness, no one to help. Lila closed her eyes, too tired to cry anymore. The sudden sweep of headlights across the lawn startled her awake. A sleek black car turned sharply into the driveway, tires splashing through puddles. The vehicle came to an abrupt halt, its engine cutting off with a decisive growl. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door swung open, and Alexander Grant emerged. The millionaire stood tall against the storm, raindrops beating on his tailored suit, as if even the elements hesitated to fully assault him. His eyes, sharp and assessing, took in the scene: the locked door, the soaked child, the silhouette visible through the glass. His face hardened with recognition and purpose. With deliberate steps, he approached the porch, his imposing figure framed by lightning as thunder rolled overhead. When he spoke, his voice cut through the chaos of the storm with a single commanding word: enough. Alexander Grant moved with purpose through the downpour, his expensive shoes sinking into puddles as he approached the trembling child. Without a word, he slipped off his wool coat and wrapped it around Lila's small frame, the fabric immediately enveloping her like a protective cocoon. The garment was still warm from his body, a stark contrast to her rain-chilled skin. "You're safe now," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. Gently, he lifted her into his arms, surprised by how little she weighed. Lila didn't resist or speak. She simply clung to this stranger whose sudden appearance felt like an answer to an unspoken prayer. The interior of Alexander's sleek vehicle welcomed them with leather-scented warmth. He placed her carefully in the passenger seat, cranking up the heat before closing her door. As he slid behind the wheel, he noticed her wide eyes taking in the luxury surrounding her: the soft glow of the dashboard lights, the plush seats, the sense of security that had been so foreign to her existence. "My name is Alexander," he said, keeping his voice steady and calm. "I'm taking you somewhere dry and warm. Is that all right?" Leela nodded, her fingers clutching the edges of his coat. The millionaire drove carefully through the rain-slicked streets of suburban Virginia, occasionally glancing at his passenger. She remained silent, but her eyes were alert, watching the familiar neighborhood fade into the distance. The windshield wipers created a hypnotic rhythm as they traveled, and gradually, the child's shivering subsided. The rain continued its assault against the windows, but inside the vehicle, a fragile trust was beginning to form. "It's not far now," he assured her, as they turned onto a private road lined with ancient oaks. When his estate came into view, Leela pressed her face against the window. The imposing structure stood illuminated against the night sky, windows glowing with warm light. The car crunched over gravel as they approached the main entrance. Alexander parked and turned to her. "This is my home. You can stay here tonight, where it's safe and dry." For the first time since he'd found her, Leela spoke. "Will she come looking for me?" Her voice was small but clear, heavy with a child's understanding of complicated adult situations. "Not tonight," he answered truthfully. "Tonight, you rest." He led her inside, where the warmth enveloped them immediately. The spacious entrance hall, with its polished floors and soft lighting, felt like another world compared to the cold porch she'd been banished to. As Alexander guided her further into the house, Leela's fingers loosened their grip on his coat, her shoulders relaxing slightly. This estate, with its quiet grandeur and promise of safety, had become an unexpected sanctuary, a temporary haven from the storm, both literal and figurative, that had defined her young life. By the time the Virginia sun rose, Delilah Matthews was already on the phone with the police. Tears streamed down her perfectly made-up face as she paced the living room in her designer robe. "My stepdaughter ran away during a tantrum," she sobbed into the receiver. "And now this strange man has taken her. Please, you have to help me get my little girl back." Within hours, the suburban neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Delilah had crafted her narrative with surgical precision, telling neighbors how Lila had become increasingly difficult since her father's hospitalization. The stepmother dabbed at her eyes with monogrammed handkerchiefs as she accepted consoling hugs from women who had never before been invited past her front door. "She's always been troubled," Delilah whispered to the detective who arrived at her immaculate home. "Her father's condition has made her act out. I've tried everything." She presented a carefully curated photo album showing smiling family portraits, images taken for social media, but never reflecting their private reality. Alexander Grant found himself suddenly cast as the villain. When police officers arrived at his estate, he maintained his composure, explaining how he'd found the child abandoned in the rain. The authorities seemed skeptical, their eyes taking in his wealth with suspicion rather than deference. "Mr. Grant, regardless of your intentions, you can't simply take a minor from their legal guardian," the lead officer explained, his tone suggesting the millionaire's money wouldn't help this time. The legal machinery moved with surprising speed. By afternoon, a judge had ordered Leela returned to Delilah's custody pending investigation. The system, swayed by the stepmother's tearful performance and her standing in the community, defaulted to traditional family structures despite the child's protests. When they came to collect her, Leela clung to the banister of Alexander's staircase. "Please don't make me go back," she whispered, her small fingers white with effort. The social worker gently pried her hands loose, promising everything would be okay. Alexander watched helplessly as they led her away, his jaw tight with controlled fury. As the car disappeared down his driveway, he turned to his phone and made 3 calls in rapid succession, to his lawyer, to a private investigator, and to an old friend at the local newspaper. In his study, surrounded by books and silence, the reclusive millionaire began plotting a response. He remembered the terror in Lila's eyes on that rain-soaked porch. The truth he had glimpsed demanded action, not just outrage. As night fell again over Virginia, Alexander Grant opened his laptop and began a meticulous documentation of everything he had witnessed. This battle would require strategy, patience, and resources, all things he possessed in abundance. In the warm sanctuary of Alexander Grant's estate, 8-year-old Lila found herself breathing freely for the first time in years. The greenhouse became her haven, a glass-walled world where time moved differently. Here, Among exotic plants and dancing motes of sunlight, she gathered her treasures: twigs fallen from ancient oaks, sea glass polished smooth, and pearl buttons that reminded her of her mother's favorite dress. "What are you building?" Alexander asked one afternoon, his tall frame casting a gentle shadow across her work. Leela's small fingers continued arranging the materials with surprising precision. "A house," she whispered, not looking up. "One that never locks people out." A miniature structure took shape day by day. Walls of twigs bound with thread, windows of colored glass, a tiny door that actually opened and closed. Alexander watched from a respectful distance, recognizing in her creation something profoundly important. The estate staff grew accustomed to the quiet child who moved like a ghost through the grand rooms. Mrs. Bennet, the housekeeper, left snacks that disappeared without a sound. The gardener found his spare plant markers repurposed as tiny fence posts. No one minded. There was something about Lila that inspired protection rather than annoyance. At night, lying in a bed larger than any she'd known, the girl struggled with conflicting emotions. The comfort of Alexander's home felt like a dream that could vanish at any moment. She carefully folded her clothes each evening, kept her few possessions in her backpack, ready to leave when the inevitable happened. People always sent her back eventually. "You're not a burden," Alexander told her one evening, somehow reading her thoughts as she picked at her dinner. His voice was gruff, but kind. "This house has been too empty for too long." Leela nodded, but didn't believe him. Her intuition, sharpened by years of navigating Delilah's unpredictable moods, told her that storm clouds were gathering. She could sense tension in the phone calls Alexander took in his study, the hushed conversations with men in suits who came and went with serious expressions. One afternoon, she found him staring at old photographs in the library. "You knew my mom," she said. It wasn't a question. The millionaire looked up, surprised. "Yes," he answered simply. Leela returned to her miniature house, adding a tiny figure made of twisted wire and cloth scraps. The figure stood protective and tall beside a smaller one. She didn't explain their meaning, but Alexander's eyes grew suspiciously bright when he noticed them later that day. The battle brewing beyond the estate walls would soon reach them, but for now, her hands continued building the home her heart had always wanted. Alexander Grant stood at the window of his estate, watching raindrops trace patterns down the glass. Each droplet reminded him of tears he'd shed in foster homes across Virginia, places where he'd been just another forgotten child. The millionaire's imposing frame belied the vulnerability that still lived within him. Awakened by the sight of Lila shivering in that merciless storm, "She has her mother's eyes," he whispered to himself. Memories flooded back of 20 years earlier, when he was just a teenage runaway with empty pockets and emptier prospects. It was Lila's mother who had found him sleeping in the back of the restaurant where she waited tables. Instead of calling the police, she had offered him food, a place to stay, and something far more precious: dignity. The wealthy businessman traced his finger along the window's edge. That simple act of kindness had changed everything. He'd promised himself that if he ever succeeded, he would repay that debt. Now, with her daughter locked out in the rain, the universe had delivered his chance in the cruelest way possible. Alexander moved to his study, where photographs and documents about Delilah were spread across his mahogany desk. The private investigator had already uncovered disturbing patterns: unexplained bruises on Lila's arms, suspicious absences from school, neighbors who'd heard crying but looked the other way. The wealthy suburbs of Virginia excelled at maintaining appearances, even at a child's expense. "This ends now," he said, picking up his smartphone to call his attorney. Each new piece of evidence strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about honoring a promise to a woman who'd saved him decades ago. In Lila's frightened eyes, he saw his younger self, the boy who'd prayed each night for someone, anyone, to notice his suffering. The businessman poured himself a small glass of bourbon, contemplating his next move. Taking on Delilah meant challenging not just one woman, but the entire social structure that protected people like her. The socialite had connections, influence, and the presumption of respectability on her side. But Alexander had something stronger: the truth, and resources to uncover more of it. As rain continued to drum against the windows, he began making calls to child welfare agencies, former neighbors, and school officials. Each conversation was another strand in the web he was weaving to ensure Lila's safety. "I couldn't save myself then," he murmured, looking at a rare photograph of himself as a child, "but I can save her now." The healing of his own past and Lila's future had become inextricably linked, bound together by a promise made in the rain. On her third day at Alexander Grant's estate, Lila wandered into a sunlit room she hadn't yet explored. The space smelled of lemon oil and aged wood, with tall windows that caught the morning light. A silver-haired man sat in the corner, his weathered hands moving across the strings of a violin with practiced grace. "Hello there," he said, lowering the instrument. "You must be the young guest Alexander mentioned." Lila nodded shyly, keeping her distance. The retired violinist smiled warmly, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. "I'm Walter. I live in the cottage just beyond those trees," he explained, gesturing toward the window. "Alexander lets me use this room whenever I wish." The 8-year-old inched closer, drawn by the polished maple of the violin. Walter noticed her fascination and held out the instrument. "Would you like to try?" he asked. "Your hands are small, but so were your mother's when she first started." Lila's eyes widened. "You knew my mom?" Walter's gaze grew distant. "Some days my memory plays tricks on me," he admitted. "But music stays. Your mother had a gift. I taught her for several summers when she was not much older than you." With gentle guidance, the elderly musician positioned the violin under Lila's chin. Her first notes were hesitant scratches, but Walter didn't wince. Instead, he nodded encouragingly. "Feel the wood vibrate against you," he instructed. "That's how you know the instrument is speaking." Over the following days, Lila returned to the music room whenever she could. The sharp scent of wood polish and rosin became a comfort, something stable in her uncertain world. Walter's patience never wavered, even when he occasionally forgot what they had practiced the day before. "Sometimes I lose yesterday," he confessed one afternoon, "but the music always brings me back." Lila understood more than he realized. She too struggled to hold on to fragments of happiness from her past. Her father's laugh, her mother's voice, moments before Delilah had entered their lives. Alexander often paused outside the door, listening to their sessions. He never interrupted, but made sure fresh tea and cookies appeared mysteriously during their breaks. "Music gives shape to feelings we can't express," Walter told Lila as she practiced a simple melody. "When words fail, the violin speaks." The child nodded solemnly, drawing the bow across strings with increasing confidence. In this room, with this gentle mentor, she found something beyond mere shelter from the storm. She found a voice. The violin connected her to her mother's past while offering a language for her present pain, a bridge between who she had been and who she might become. Delilah's phone chimed with the email she had been waiting for. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled slightly as she read the confirmation. She had been selected to host the annual Children's Hope Foundation Gala. This was her moment, her ascension to the highest echelon of Virginia's social elite. A smile spread across her face as she imagined the envious glances from the women who had once looked down on her. "They'll all see who I really am now," she whispered to herself, already mentally arranging the guest list. The suburban Virginia charity circuit was the perfect stage for her performance, and Delilah was determined to be the star. Over the following weeks, she transformed into a whirlwind of activity. Her days filled with afternoon teas at the most exclusive establishments, where she would casually mention her role as gala chairwoman. The stepmother arranged tastings with 3 different caterers, rejecting each dish that wasn't absolutely perfect. Every detail had to reflect her impeccable taste, from the hand-calligraphed invitations to the imported flowers that would adorn each table. At the private academy where she hoped to enroll Lila, Delilah charmed the admissions director with promises of connecting the school to potential donors at her event. "My stepdaughter would benefit so much from your guidance," she cooed, conveniently omitting how she treated the child behind closed doors. Yet beneath the polished exterior, hairline fractures were beginning to show when her closest friend, Caroline, mentioned seeing Alexander Grant's vehicle parked near their neighborhood. Delilah's champagne glass nearly slipped from her grasp. "He's just an eccentric recluse," she dismissed with forced lightness. "Probably lost his way." But the whispers continued. At her regular salon appointment, Delilah overheard two women discussing how Alexander had been asking questions about Lila's welfare. Her stylist noticed how she gripped the armrests until her knuckles turned white. That evening, alone in her kitchen with a glass of red wine, she scrolled through her social media, obsessively checking who had RSVP'd to the gala. The numbers were good, but several key society matrons remained uncommitted. One had even mentioned running into Alexander at a local restaurant, describing him as surprisingly charming. Delilah's phone buzzed with a text from the event planner requesting an additional deposit. Money was getting tighter than she cared to admit. She glanced toward Lila's room, thinking of the trust fund that remained frustratingly just beyond her complete control. "Everything is fine," she whispered to her reflection in the darkened window. But the woman staring back seemed less certain, her carefully constructed world beginning to wobble on its axis. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Alexander Grant's estate, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors. Alexander had been organizing the music room when his fingers brushed against something unusual inside the old violin case, a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with elegant handwriting. He recognized the penmanship immediately. This belonged to Lila's mother. His heart raced as he carefully opened the fragile binding, revealing years of detailed entries. The millionaire settled into an armchair, losing himself in the painful narrative that unfolded before him. "Delilah arrived today," one entry read. "She's charming, but there's something calculated in how she watches my husband. I fear her interest isn't genuine." Later entries grew more concerning. "She's slowly isolating him from our friends. When I question this, she makes me sound paranoid." Alexander's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The journal documented Delilah's systematic manipulation, first of Lila's father, then of their social circle, and finally her methodical efforts to separate Lila from her remaining parent. The woman had orchestrated a complete takeover of the family, positioning herself to control both Lila and her inheritance. "I must protect Lila if anything happens to me," the final entry read. "I don't trust Delilah's intentions toward my daughter." The wealthy recluse closed the journal, his jaw set with determination. This was the evidence he needed, proof that the stepmother's cruelty toward Lila wasn't new, but part of a calculated pattern. He reached for his phone and made 3 calls in quick succession. By evening, Alexander had assembled a small team of allies: the private investigator he'd hired weeks earlier, his attorney, and 2 longtime friends of Lila's father, who had mysteriously been pushed out of the family's life shortly after Delilah's arrival. "We need surveillance footage from the night I found her," he instructed, pacing the length of his study. "And I want financial records, everything connected to Lila's trust fund." The investigator nodded, already making notes. "I can have the security camera footage from your street by tomorrow. If she locked the child out deliberately, we'll see it." Alexander stared out the window toward the neighboring property where Lila had been returned. The journal felt heavy in his hands, a weight of responsibility, but also of hope. For the first time since he'd rescued the little girl from the rain, He had concrete evidence of Delilah's true nature. "She won't spend another night in that house," he vowed quietly. "Not if I can help it." The courthouse steps felt like a mountain to 8-year-old Lila as she descended them, Alexander Grant's warm hand slipping from hers. The judge's ruling echoed in her ears. The child will return to her stepmother's custody pending further investigation. Alexander's face had hardened into stone, but his eyes promised her this wasn't over. Delilah's fingers dug into Lila's shoulder as they walked to the car, her painted nails like talons beneath the fabric of Lila's dress. "Smile," she hissed through perfect teeth. "Everyone's watching." The suburban Virginia house that had once been home now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to have closed in during Lila's absence, and the temperature inside remained unnaturally cold despite the summer heat. Delilah had removed all photos of Lila's father from the walls, erasing his presence completely. "You've embarrassed me," Delilah said that first night, voice honeyed but eyes glacial. "Do you understand what you've done? The neighbors talk, my friends ask questions." When no one was looking, the stepmother's mask slipped entirely. She confiscated Lila's shoes to prevent further escape attempts and installed new locks on the bedroom door, this time on the outside. The little girl lay awake that night, the memory of Alexander's greenhouse and the retired violinist's gentle hands on the instrument strings feeling like a distant dream. She pressed her face into the pillow to muffle her sobs, knowing tears would only fuel Delilah's satisfaction. While cleaning under her bed the next day, Lila discovered an old toy walkie-talkie, forgotten from happier times. She pressed the button experimentally, surprised to find it still worked. A plan formed in her mind. "You're just like your mother," Delilah spat during one of her tirades, unaware of the small device hidden beneath a pile of clothes. "Ungrateful, manipulative. You think that millionaire actually cares about you? He's using you to get back at me." Each note, Lila would retrieve the walkie-talkie from its hiding place and record Delilah's verbal assaults. The small act of resistance gave her purpose. When the socialite entertained guests, presenting herself as the concerned, loving guardian, Lila would catch her eye across the room, and something in her gaze made Delilah falter mid-sentence. Alexander called whenever legally permitted, his voice a lifeline across the digital divide. "Stay strong," he would say. "We're making progress." Lila clutched the walkie-talkie like a talisman each night, whispering into it as if it could carry her words directly to Alexander. "I'm collecting evidence. I'm fighting back." In the darkness of her locked room, she was no longer just a victim. She was becoming her own rescuer. The manila folder landed on Alexander's mahogany desk with a soft thud. The private investigator, a woman with 20 years of experience and an uncompromising dedication to truth, stood with arms crossed as Alexander examined the contents. "The marriage license was never properly filed," she explained. Delilah and Lila's father completed the ceremony, but the paperwork was submitted with critical errors and never rectified. "Legally speaking, she has no familial claim to the child." Alexander Grant ran his fingers through his hair, the implications settling over him like morning fog. This discovery could change everything. Without legal standing as Lila's stepmother, Delilah's guardianship claims stood on shaky ground. The wealth and resources he'd dedicated to this case were finally bearing fruit. "Can we verify this independently?" he asked. Already done. 3 separate county offices confirmed it. She's been living on borrowed legitimacy. Across town, in a sunlit breakfast nook of the Westbrook Country Club, Delilah's carefully constructed world was beginning to fray at the edges. She stirred her mimosa nervously as Patricia Holloway, once her staunchest defender in Virginia's social circles, examined her with newfound scrutiny. "I ran into Margaret at the hospital fundraiser," Patricia said, her voice honeyed but her eyes sharp. "She mentioned seeing Lila outside alone that night, during the thunderstorm." Delilah's smile tightened. "You know how children exaggerate. Leela was simply upset about bedtime. In her pajamas? In the rain? Patricia sipped her drink. And now I hear Alexander Grant has filed for emergency custody. The conversation shifted, but the damage was done. By afternoon, 3 invitations to upcoming social events had been rescinded with polite but transparent excuses. The whispers were spreading through suburban Virginia like wildfire. Inconsistencies in Delilah's stories, questions about her relationship with Leela, concerns about her financial arrangements. Meanwhile, Alexander sat in his vehicle outside Leela's elementary school, waiting. The private investigator's findings had given him leverage, but legal battles were unpredictable. What mattered most was protecting the child who had awakened something long dormant in his heart. His smartphone buzzed with a message from his attorney. Marriage license findings confirmed. Filing emergency petition tomorrow. Alexander allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. The web Delilah had woven was unraveling thread by thread. Her social standing, the currency she valued above all else, was depreciating rapidly as doubt spread through her carefully cultivated circles. For the first time since that rainy night, the balance of power was shifting. Alexander started the engine, his resolve hardening. The truth was emerging, and with it, Leela's chance for safety and belonging. The call came at 3 in the morning. Alexander Grant fumbled for his smartphone in the darkness, his heart racing when he saw the hospital's number on the screen. For months, Thomas Parker had remained in a vegetative state, his body present but his consciousness adrift somewhere beyond reach. The doctors had warned that recovery was unlikely. "Mr. Grant?" The night nurse's voice was hushed, but urgent. "Mr. Parker showed signs of consciousness about 20 minutes ago. It was brief, but significant." Alexander sat upright, fully awake now. "Did he say anything? Is he still conscious?" "He slipped back under, I'm afraid. But yes, he spoke. Just one word, actually." The nurse paused. "He said, 'Alex,' very clearly. We thought you should know immediately." The significance of that single word hung in the air. Thomas Parker, a man who hadn't spoken in nearly a year, had used his momentary return to consciousness to utter Alexander's name. Not Delilah's, not even his daughter's, but his. By dawn, Alexander was at the hospital, standing beside Thomas's bed. The man looked frail against the white sheets, medical equipment beeping steadily around him. The private investigator Alexander had hired waited discreetly in the hallway, documenting everything. "I'm here, old friend," Alexander whispered, clasping Thomas's limp hand. "I'm watching over Leela, just like I promised her mother." When Delilah arrived 2 hours later, her face carefully composed into an expression of wifely concern, the attending physician informed her of Thomas's brief awakening and his spoken word. "Alex?" she repeated, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palm. "Who is Alex?" Perhaps he was confused. The doctor glanced at Alexander, who stood silently by the window. Sometimes patients in his condition access older memories first. The name clearly meant something important to him. News of Thomas's brief awakening spread quickly through the suburban Virginia community. The socialite friends who had once embraced Delilah's narrative began whispering new theories. Why would a father, given just seconds of consciousness, call for a neighbor instead of his wife? For Leela, the news brought a flicker of hope. "Do you think Daddy will wake up again?" she asked Alexander that evening as he helped her practice a new violin piece. "I don't know, sweetheart," he answered honestly. "But he remembered me, and that means he remembers what matters." At her house that night, Delilah paced the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. "It changes nothing," she hissed to her lawyer. "Thomas is still incapacitated. I still have guardianship." But her voice betrayed her uncertainty. In one fragile moment, with one whispered name, the foundation of her carefully constructed world had begun to crack. Alexander Grant found himself drawn to the miniature house Leela had been meticulously crafting in the corner of his estate's greenhouse. The afternoon light filtered through the glass panels, casting gentle shadows over her creation. Kneeling beside the intricate structure, he noticed something that made his breath catch. A small figurine placed near the entrance, unmistakably resembling himself. "Who's this supposed to be?" he asked softly, careful not to sound accusatory. Leela looked up from where she was arranging tiny flowers made of colored paper. Her eyes widened momentarily before she answered, "That's you." The millionaire's expression softened. "Me? But we only met that night in the rain." The 8-year-old shook her head, her small fingers fidgeting with a twig. "I saw you before, in the woods behind our house, 2 summers ago. You were walking alone." She paused, gathering courage. "You looked sad, but kind. I watched you from my window sometimes." Alexander sat back, stunned by this revelation. The property adjacent to his estate? He'd walked those woods countless times, seeking solitude after difficult days. Never once had he imagined a child's eyes following his solitary figure, much less incorporating him into her dreams of safety. "I made you the guardian," Lila continued, pointing to where the figurine stood. "In my pretend world, you watched over the house and kept the storms away." Something tightened in his chest. "Even before you knew me?" She nodded, her expression serious beyond her years. "I needed someone. Dad was in the hospital, and Delilah—" Her voice trailed off, the unspoken trauma hanging between them. The protective instinct that had driven him to stop his car that rainy night suddenly made more sense. Perhaps it wasn't just chance or obligation to her mother that had guided him. Something deeper had been at work. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the miniature structure. When Lila nodded, Alexander carefully examined her creation. The reinforced walls, the multiple exits, the windows positioned to catch maximum sunlight. It wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of safety designed by a child who had known too much danger. "You've built something remarkable here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not finished," she replied. "The inside still needs work." Alexander looked at the child, seeing both her vulnerability and her strength. "We have time," he assured her. "We can build it together." In that greenhouse, surrounded by growing things, a different kind of growth was taking place, a bond forming between 2 wounded souls. Alexander realized that Lila's hope had reached out for rescue long before he'd answered its call, and he silently renewed his promise not to let that hope down. The manila envelope landed on Alexander Grant's desk with a soft thud. The private investigator stood across from him, arms folded, expression grim. "You were right," he said. "Delilah's been intercepting everything. Birthday cards, Christmas presents, letters, all from Leela's father at the hospital. She's kept every single one." Alexander opened the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly as he spread the contents across his mahogany desk. Colorful envelopes addressed in shaky handwriting to "My Little Sunshine" lay beside small wrapped packages. Even in his weakened state, Lila's father had never forgotten her. "How did you find these?" Alexander asked. "Hidden compartment in her bedroom closet. The housekeeper let me in when Delilah was at her lunch meeting. Poor woman's been suspicious for months." Alexander picked up a birthday card dated 3 years earlier. Inside, a $20 bill was still tucked beside a heartfelt message. The father had tried so hard to maintain a connection with his daughter, while the stepmother had methodically severed every thread. "There's something else," the investigator said, pulling out a yellowed envelope from his jacket. This was buried at the bottom. "It's from Lila's mother." Alexander's breath caught. The letter was dated just weeks before her death, nearly 8 years ago. He carefully unfolded the brittle paper, recognizing the handwriting immediately. "If you're reading this," it began, "something has happened to both me and James." The words blurred as Alexander continued reading. Her mother had named him, Alexander Grant, as Leela's guardian, should anything happen to both parents. The woman who had once shown him kindness when he was just a troubled youth had trusted him with her most precious treasure. "She remembered me," he whispered. "This changes everything," the investigator said. Legally speaking, Delilah never had a right to guardianship. The mother's wishes, plus the father never being declared incompetent, just medically incapacitated, means you have a solid case. Alexander carefully refolded the letter. Leila needs to know her father never abandoned her. That he's been trying to reach her all these years. What about the mother's letter? Not yet, Alexander replied. First, we need to show Leila that she was never forgotten or unloved. Then, we use this letter to make sure she never spends another night in that house. He gathered the cards and gifts, imagining Leila's face when she discovered her father had remembered every birthday, every Christmas. These weren't just presents. They were proof that she had always been loved, even when the rain poured down and the door remained locked. Make copies of everything, Alexander instructed, especially the mother's letter. We'll need them for court. The charity gala loomed just 3 days away, and Delilah paced the marble floors of her suburban Virginia home, phone pressed to her ear. The event planner on the other end was delivering bad news about the floral arrangements. "I don't care what it costs," she hissed, glancing nervously at the stack of unpaid bills hidden beneath a designer handbag. "The Montgomery Foundation expects perfection." Every detail of the gala consumed her thoughts. The historic mansion venue had been secured months ago, but now 1,000 little crises threatened her carefully constructed facade. Delilah's social ascent had been calculated over years, and this event represented her crowning achievement, her final step into Virginia's most elite circles. In the kitchen, Lila sat quietly drawing, trying to make herself invisible. The 8-year-old had learned that when her stepmother's voice took on that tight, controlled quality, it was best to disappear. She traced small circles on her paper, creating another miniature house design. "You'll wear the blue dress," Delilah informed her without looking up from her clipboard. "And remember, when people ask, you're excited about your new private school." The woman's smile appeared and vanished like lightning, present only when necessary, never reaching her eyes. Across town, Alexander Grant sat in a wood-paneled conference room, his imposing presence commanding attention as the Charity Gala Committee finalized their plans. His substantial donation had secured him not just a seat at the table, but a position of influence. "I'd like to propose a small change to the evening's program," he said, his voice measured and deliberate. The committee members leaned forward, eager to accommodate the millionaire's wishes. "I believe we should include a brief spotlight on family foundations, specifically those benefiting children in difficult circumstances." The committee chair nodded enthusiastically. "Excellent suggestion, Mr. Grant." Alexander's phone buzzed with a message from his private investigator. Financial records obtained. Evidence of trust fund misappropriation confirmed. Meanwhile, Delilah stood before her bedroom mirror, rehearsing her welcome speech. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her necklace. Everything depended on this night: her reputation, her financial security, her carefully constructed life. The pressure was becoming unbearable. She didn't know that Alexander had methodically positioned himself at the center of her social world, or that he now possessed evidence of her financial improprieties. The charity gala would bring them face to face in a public setting where appearances meant everything. As evening fell, Leila watched her stepmother frantically preparing, unaware that both adults were setting the stage for a confrontation that would determine her future. The little girl simply hoped that, for once, she might be allowed to enjoy the music. With only 3 days until the charity gala, Delilah paced her kitchen, phone pressed against her ear. "I need another $20,000 transferred today," she hissed, glancing nervously out the window. The caterer had threatened to cancel without an additional deposit, and her custom gown still needed final alterations. "Mrs. Reynolds, I must advise against another withdrawal from Lila's trust fund," the bank manager replied cautiously. "There have been several large transactions recently that—" "Do you know who I am?" Delilah snapped, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against the marble countertop. My stepdaughter's father established that trust for her care, which includes maintaining our social standing. Just make the transfer. After ending the call, she poured herself a generous glass of wine. The stepmother had been hemorrhaging money for months. Designer clothes, luxury spa treatments, and now this extravagant gala. Lila's trust fund had become her personal ATM, the 8-year-old none the wiser about her dwindling inheritance. Across town, Alexander Grant reviewed financial records with his investigative team. She's taken nearly $200,000 in the past 6 months, he said, sliding the documents across the table. All while Lila wears second-hand clothes and sleeps in an unheated bedroom. The private investigator nodded grimly. We've got the bank records, but Delilah's lawyer is blocking our petition for emergency custody. Speaking of which, he hesitated. Your former attorney, James Wilson, has been feeding her information about our strategy. Alexander's jaw tightened. The betrayal stung, but wasn't surprising. Wilson had always been drawn to power and money. Can we use that against them? Already on it, the investigator replied. I've planted some false information. When they act on it, we'll know for certain. Meanwhile, a local reporter had begun asking questions about Delilah's sudden lavish spending. Sources say the Reynolds Charity Gala is being funded through questionable means, she wrote in her draft. Unaware that her investigation would soon intersect with Alexander's efforts. That evening, Delilah stood in Lila's doorway. You will behave perfectly at this gala, she instructed coldly. The right people will be watching. Lila nodded silently, her small fingers fidgeting with the hem of her worn sweater. She had overheard enough phone conversations to understand something important was happening, something that made her stepmother more dangerous than usual. In his estate, Alexander stared at Lila's miniature house, remembering her trembling form in the rain. The legal battle had become more complicated, but he remained undeterred. The wealthy protector had promised himself and Lila's mother that he would keep the child safe. Tomorrow, he would make his next move. The stakes had never been higher. Alexander Grant's smartphone vibrated on his desk, interrupting his review of legal documents. The screen displayed Lila's name, unusual for this time of day when she should have been at school. He tapped the notification, expecting a simple pocket dial. What he heard instead froze his blood. I don't know if I can do this anymore, Lila's voice whispered, trembling between muffled sobs. She took away my violin after you called yesterday. Said I don't deserve nice things. I'm hiding in the closet now. The lock on my bedroom door is backwards again. She can lock me in whenever she wants. A sharp intake of breath followed. I miss the greenhouse. I miss... The message cut off abruptly with sounds of a door opening and Delilah's voice demanding to know who Lila was talking to. The millionaire sat motionless, the device still pressed to his ear. This accidental voicemail revealed what he had suspected but couldn't prove. Delilah's abuse had escalated since the court had returned Lila to her care. The child's voice, so small and frightened, contained a desperation that cut through his usual reserve. He immediately called his attorney. I need emergency guardianship papers filed today. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. He forwarded the voicemail, along with the private investigator's latest findings about the intercepted letters and misappropriated trust fund money. Within hours, the legal machinery was in motion. Alexander's team filed for immediate removal of Lila from Delilah's custody, citing emotional abuse and financial exploitation. The evidence was substantial. The voicemail, bank records showing Delilah's misuse of Lila's inheritance, and statements from school teachers noting the girl's declining emotional state. Delilah retaliated with fury. She hired Alexander's former lawyer, who promptly launched a media campaign painting his client as a devoted stepmother defending her family against a wealthy stalker. Local news vans parked outside both houses, turning their private battle into public spectacle. That evening, Alexander stood at his window, watching reporters clustered at the edge of his property. The retired violinist joined him, his weathered hands resting on the windowsill. "She's strong, but she needs you now more than ever," the old musician said quietly. Alexander nodded. "I promised her mother I'd protect her. I won't fail her again." As darkness fell, he received word that the judge had scheduled an emergency hearing for the following morning. The breaking point had arrived, for Lila, for Delilah, and for himself. Tomorrow would determine whether the little girl who had stood shivering in the rain would finally find shelter in a permanent home. The historic mansion glowed like a jewel against the night sky, its grand windows spilling golden light onto the manicured lawns. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over Virginia's social elite, gathered for what Delilah had promised would be the charity event of the season. Champagne flowed freely as string musicians played softly in the corner, their melodies floating above the polite conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. Delilah Reynolds moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her emerald gown catching the light with each calculated turn. Her smile never faltered, though anyone looking closely might notice how her fingers clutched her champagne glass a little too tightly, how her eyes darted nervously toward the entrance whenever the doors opened. "Simply marvelous what you've done with the event," an older socialite gushed, touching Delilah's arm. "The Children's Hospital will be so grateful." The stepmother nodded graciously, though her thoughts were elsewhere. Alexander Grant had yet to make an appearance, and his absence left her on edge. She'd heard whispers of legal documents and emergency hearings, rumors that made her stomach twist into knots beneath her designer gown. Across the room, the private investigator Alexander had hired lingered near a potted palm, his presence almost invisible among the glittering guests. He observed Delilah's performance with detached interest, occasionally touching the smartphone in his pocket, where evidence against her was securely stored. Meanwhile, back at Delilah's house, 8-year-old Lila sat on her bed, listening to the babysitter's footsteps fade as she became engrossed in a television show downstairs. The child's small hands trembled as she reached under her mattress for her violin case. She had practiced for this moment, planned it carefully during the long hours alone in her room. The rain had started again, a gentle patter against her window that seemed to urge her forward. Lila slipped out through the kitchen door, her bare feet silent on the wet grass. The violin case felt heavy in her arms, but she clutched it tightly as she made her way through the darkness toward the historic mansion just 3 blocks away. By the time she reached the gala, Lila was soaked through, her simple cotton dress clinging to her small frame. She slipped in through a service entrance, following the sound of voices until she found herself backstage. Water dripped from her hair onto the polished floor as she removed her violin from its case. Without hesitation, the child walked directly onto the stage during a break in the musical performance. The crowd fell silent as Lila stood there, barefoot and dripping, her eyes finding Delilah's shocked face in the crowd. Then, with trembling hands, she raised the violin to her chin, her gaze burning with a determination that belied her years. The grand ballroom fell silent as Lila stood on stage, her small frame dwarfed by the ornate backdrop of the historic mansion. The 8-year-old's fingers trembled slightly as she positioned the violin beneath her chin. Her eyes, reflecting both fear and determination, briefly found Alexander Grant in the crowd. He nodded almost imperceptibly, and that was all she needed. The first notes emerged hesitantly, then grew in confidence. Raw, untrained, but filled with such emotion that the audience collectively held their breath. Virginia's social elite, dressed in their finest attire, stood transfixed as the child played a simple melody her mother had once hummed while braiding her hair. "Who is she?" whispered one guest to another, the question rippling through the crowd. Delilah stood frozen near the champagne fountain, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the shock distorting her features. This wasn't part of her meticulously planned gala. The live stream cameras, intended to capture her triumph as hostess, now focused entirely on the barefoot child in the simple dress. As Leela played, something magical happened. The music seemed to weave invisible threads between past and present, between loss and hope. Even those who knew nothing of her story felt tears welling in their eyes. The retired violinist, seated near the front, nodded in gentle approval at his pupil's courage. Then came the moment that changed everything. The walkie-talkie, hidden in the folds of Leela's dress as her only security blanket, suddenly crackled to life. Perhaps it was the vibration of the violin, or perhaps fate itself intervened. But the device connected to the gala's sound system through some technical glitch. Delilah's voice, cold and cutting, filled the ballroom. "You worthless little burden. Your father never wanted you. Nobody wants you. You'll stay outside until you learn your lesson." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Lila stopped playing, her eyes wide with fear and something else, relief that the truth was finally heard. The private investigator, positioned near the audio controls, made no move to silence the recording as it continued. More vicious words poured forth, each one stripping away the veneer of the perfect stepmother Delilah had cultivated. "My God," whispered one of Delilah's former socialite friends, hand covering her mouth in horror. Alexander moved swiftly through the crowd toward Leela, his face a mask of controlled fury and protective concern. Meanwhile, Delilah's carefully constructed world crumbled around her as phones recorded the moment. Live stream numbers soared, and her mask, maintained for so long, finally shattered completely. In that moment of public reckoning, the truth that had been locked away for years finally escaped. Much like the music from Leela's violin, raw, painful, but ultimately liberating. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered her verdict. After reviewing the recordings, testimonies, and the evidence collected by the private investigator, she granted Alexander Grant full custody of Leela. It wasn't his wealth or influence that swayed the decision, but the undeniable truth captured in Leela's own voice, a child's courage that spoke louder than all of Delilah's carefully crafted lies. "The court finds clear and compelling evidence of emotional abuse and neglect," the judge stated firmly. "Custody is hereby granted to Mr. Grant, with immediate effect." Lila's small hand trembled in Alexander's as they exited the courthouse. Reporters swarmed around them, their questions a stark contrast to the suspicious accusations they'd leveled just weeks earlier. Now they praised the millionaire for his unwavering protection of the child. The headline shifted from "Wealthy recluse kidnaps child" to "Local businessman saves young girl from abusive home." Delilah's carefully constructed social empire crumbled overnight. Her charity board positions were rescinded, invitations dried up, and the socialite friends who once hung on her every word now crossed the street to avoid her. Her legal team abandoned her case when financial irregularities in Lila's trust fund came to light. The woman who had locked a child out in the rain now found herself on the outside of the very society she had desperately fought to climb. Meanwhile, Leela's father showed signs of improvement. Though still unable to care for his daughter, he approved of Alexander's guardianship through a court representative. The retired violinist continued his lessons with Leela, his gentle guidance helping her process her experiences through music. "You're safe now," Alexander told her one evening as they sat in the greenhouse. "This is your home for as long as you want it to be." The child looked up at him, her resilience shining through. "I never thought anyone would believe me," she whispered. "Sometimes," he replied, "the truth just needs someone brave enough to speak it." In the following weeks, Alexander established a foundation to help children in similar situations, using his resources to ensure no child would suffer in silence as Leela had. The private investigator continued working with them, bringing his expertise to cases that might otherwise fall through the cracks of the system. The Southern Virginia community, initially scandalized by the disruption to their social hierarchy, gradually embraced the new order, one where authenticity mattered more than appearances, and where a child's welfare took precedence over adult reputations. For Leela, each day brought new healing. The nightmares of being locked outside gradually faded, replaced by dreams of possibility. And Alexander, once isolated in his wealth, found that in saving Leela, he had also saved himself. The autumn sun painted golden streaks across the Virginia countryside as Alexander Grant's car wound up the private driveway. 8-year-old Leela sat beside him, her small hands clutching a blindfold over her eyes. For months, construction crews had been working on Alexander's property, but he'd kept the project shrouded in secrecy. "Just a few more seconds," Alexander said, his voice gentle as he guided her from the vehicle. The gravel crunched beneath their feet as they walked forward several paces. "Now." Leela removed the blindfold and gasped. Before her stood an exact replica of the miniature house she had built in the greenhouse, but life-sized, real, and breathtaking. The structure featured the same asymmetrical windows she had crafted from colored glass shards, the same stone pathway lined with wildflowers, and even the tiny weather vane she had fashioned from twisted wire. "Is this for me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The millionaire nodded, his usually composed expression softening. "Your model was the blueprint. The architects complained about some of the unusual angles, but I insisted they follow every detail." Tears welled in Lila's eyes as she approached the front door, painted the same shade of blue she had chosen for her miniature. Inside, the home was filled with sunlight from skylights, positioned exactly where she had cut openings in her model's roof. The living room featured built-in bookshelves, a window seat overlooking the garden, and a violin stand in the corner. "The music room is through there," Alexander explained, pointing to a doorway. "The retired violinist helped design the acoustics. He says it's perfect for practice." Leela wandered from room to room, touching walls and fixtures with reverent fingers. In what was clearly her bedroom, she found a collection of the letters her father had written, the ones Delilah had hidden, now framed on the wall alongside photographs of her mother. The court proceedings had concluded 2 months earlier, granting Alexander permanent guardianship. Delilah had retreated from public life, her social standing irreparably damaged by the revelations at the gala. Standing in the center of the house, her house, Leela felt something she had nearly forgotten: belonging. Outside, a light rain began to fall, droplets tapping gently against the windows. But for the first time, the sound brought comfort rather than fear. She turned to Alexander, her eyes shining. "You didn't just stop the car that night," she whispered. "You stopped the storm." She reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation. For the first time, the rain truly faded, both outside and within her heart.